Alchemancer, Volume 2, Prism in Our Veins. Part 5, Tarum. Chapter 34. Take Your Hand in Mine. 22 years ago. Salatra was in an awful mood. It had been a long shift, and they'd been shorthanded in the store. The entire time, every customer had to be helped right now, and under no circumstances could they be wrong. Salatra hated dealing with customers, but they were a necessary evil for her to make a living. Orana, who now went by Ame, the snep name she'd chosen for herself, was a wonderful manager, and Salatra appreciated the opportunity to work, especially for a friend. Few places would look at someone with Salatra's record of theft and jail time and want to hire her. Obviously, as a former racer herself, Ame didn't care about Salatra's past. But Seed Mother. Some customers were real pieces of work. Their effect on Salatra's day clung to her like dross flowing downhill. Scrape, and you could never quite get all of it off. The bus pulled up to its next stop, and she swayed in her seat as it lurched, her body present, but her mind lost in memories of her frustrations of the day. Distracted as she was, she didn't see the approaching Sneppard until they were close enough to tap her on the shoulder. "Do you mind standing? I could use a seat." Salatra blinked back to reality, and glaring up at the one who intruded the privacy of her thoughts. He was a Sneppard in his middle years of life, dressed respectably, with a brown briefcase at his side. He was asking her to move, but he wasn't really asking. Just like the customers that don't listen and have no regard for anyone but themselves, no matter how you try to help them. "I've been standing all day." Oops, that's not her voice. I gotta find the voice. "I've been standing all day. I'd prefer to stay seated, thank you," she said in a flat and direct tone she hoped would end the conversation. It didn't. Snooty McBusinessman scowled. "Do I need to get the driver involved?" Salatra took a deep breath, refusing to back down after putting up with treatment like this all day. "I've had this seat since I boarded 3 stops ago, and I intend to stay in it until I reach my stop." "Yes, well, my stop is coming up long before yours, I'm sure. If you must break convention, then you can have the seat back when I leave." Salatra tapped a thumb on her thigh, allowing herself the pleasure of imagining her fist planted in this presumptive man's gut. "No," she said firmly. "Ask someone else." He glanced around at other passengers here in the middle of the bus. Most were Sneppards, and they were trying very hard to ignore this confrontation. He didn't ask any of them to move. Scowling, he stomped off towards the front of the bus. She watched him have a brief discussion with the driver, and then he pointed at her. The driver wore an expression similar to the one Salatra knew she must wear while dealing with a particularly abrasive customer. After nearly a minute of being waterboarded with verbal abuse and Sneppard spittle, he got up and walked back with Mr. Businessman. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to move to an empty seat towards the back," the driver said. "So ask me," Salatra said, plastering a false smile on her face. The driver sighed. "Will you please move to a different seat?" "No." "She can't do this," Mr. Business spat. "I have a premium pass." Salatra fixed him with a firm stare. "I paid just as much for my pass as you paid for yours, sir. So premium or not, I believe I should be just as entitled to a seat as you." Mr. Business's nose wrinkled like he just smelled his own dross. He fumbled for his wallet, producing his bus pass and pointing at it with a hint of a claw. "Priority seating," he sputtered. "Just because you natives can't read doesn't give you the right to do whatever you want. I'm entitled to a seat toward the front, so you can go sit with your own." She could, in fact, read, but the word priority was abused the moment it left his lips. "I believe priority is only enforced when there are no seats left," she said. "As there are still some seats toward the back, I believe you have full priority in receiving one. And as a word of caution, my own, back there, are not nearly as likely to bite you today as I am, sir. His nostrils flared, and he wheeled on the bus driver. I expect the service I've paid for. The bus driver's lips were a taut line. His ears rotated forward and down. Lights in the bus reflected off the spit in his cheek fur. His eyes were distant, as he probably counted down the hours to the end of his shift. The Sneppard, sitting next to Salatra, spoke up now for the first time in this entire encounter. Maybe it would be easiest for everyone if you moved, dear. Salatra turned to look at her neighbor. She was dressed in a plain white blouse with a long blue skirt that reached her calves, and looked to be a few years older than Salatra. I'm sorry, Salatra said, unable to keep her voice from rising. Have I done something to you other than to sit calmly beside you? You have had a rather scary look on your face since getting on the bus. Yeah, because today's been total dross, so forgive me if I don't feel like smiling right now. The woman flinched, looking unsure of whether to say anything further. Salatra thumbed over her shoulder. You really want this Dipteros to sit by you? You think he's going to be more pleasant than me? Well, the woman said meekly, now you're both yelling. I'm not yelling! Salatra barked, before cutting herself off with a stiff exhale. She forced herself to lower her volume. I'm just trying to ride the bus. The driver cleared his throat. I'm afraid that he's right. Technically speaking, you don't have priority seating, so if he wants your seat, he's allowed to have it. Salatra squeezed her own fingers so hard they started to hurt. You're kidding. The next seat is only 3 rows back, and I'm just as tired at the end of my day as he is. His legs and feet got him this far on the bus. I think they can carry him a few more feet. You don't have the first clue what my day's been like, native, Mr. Business shouted, leaning down towards her and waving a finger in her face. She snapped at it, and he flinched back with a small squeal. I could say the same about my day, sir. A sigh came from the bus driver. In the interest of de-escalation and avoiding an incident, I'm gonna have to insist you change seats, ma'am, or I'm gonna have to kick you off the bus. Mr. Business sneered in triumph. The bus driver looked miserable, but more for himself than for her. The woman beside her had turned to stare out the window. Salatra looked around at other passengers nearby, and the reaction wasn't hard to gauge. She caught 1, maybe 2 sympathetic looks from the Sneppards, but most seemed to be looking at her with scorn, as if she was the problem here. Glancing back towards the Nulfs at the rear of the bus, no one looked willing to stand up for her. Most looked embarrassed, like she was making a scene. She wanted to fight, wanted to insist, but if she did, she'd probably end up punching the man and getting thrown off the bus anyway. That was the fast track back to prison. Literally biting her own tongue as an outlet for her anger, Salatra got up without a word and moved to a different seat. It was obvious Mr. Business was a real lump of dross, but he proved it when he started harassing the woman beside him. She clearly wanted none of his attention, but that didn't stop him. She hadn't stood up for Salatra, so why should Salatra stand up for her? Salatra turned her gaze out the window, watching the buildings go by, sulking at how her already terrible day had somehow gotten even worse. They'd made it all of 2 blocks when a squeak came from her former neighbor. That was the only way to describe the noise of alarm, and Salatra caught a growing scent of fear. Glancing forward again, despite her better judgment, she saw Mr. Business leaning into the woman's space. She'd pressed herself all the way against the window, and he still wasn't taking the hint. Her ears were flat, her purse clutched tightly to her chest as her elbows brushed the glass. She was talking rapidly, and clearly didn't want to continue conversation or interaction with him. One of the other Sneppards toward the front looked over, but didn't say or do anything. They were as silent for her as they'd been for Salatra. Bunch of mulers. A few moments later, his hand was in the woman's hair. He twirled it around a finger before sniffing at it. The woman jerked back, pulling her hair out of his grip. He gave her a false apology for startling her, before lathering on compliments and assuring her that he meant nothing by it. He wore the confident smile of the kind of person who walks into a store intent on bullying the employee into giving him a discount. And still no one reacted. The woman searched around frantically, looking eager to change seats, but he was blocking her in. Her eyes met Salatra's, and they were pleading. "You brought this on yourself, woman. Don't look at me," Salatra thought, and looked away. But she could feel her own anger, and it still wasn't going away. The woman continued to speak quite rapidly, her voice elevating almost to another squeak, though Salatra wasn't watching to see what he'd done to cause it. Seed Mother, was no one going to help this woman? You did warn her, Salatra thought. She had it coming. She glanced forward and was shocked to find the woman still staring at her. There were tears at the corners of her eyes. Oh, Fanina's cracks. Salatra pulled herself to her feet. Before she'd realized what she was doing, her fingers were buried into the shoulder of Mr. Business's business jacket. Leave her alone, or I'm taking my seat back early. He turned to her, his surprise melting into fury as he stared first at her hand, then her face. Unhand me, native. I'll call the driver again. Is he bothering you, ma'am? Salatra asked the woman. She nodded vigorously, though she couldn't seem to find words to verbalize it. I'll call the snops, Mr. Business stammered. And there's a bus full of witnesses who can attest that you're being a lump of dross right now. I can promise you, the snops are the last people you want to involve. Salatra doubted that any except the woman being harassed would be bold enough to make a statement to the police. Sneppards tended to turn a blind eye the moment Nolfs got involved. Thankfully, her bluff shut him up anyway. Oh, look, she said as the bus began to slow. We're coming up on your stop. Looking out the window, he frowned. This isn't my stop. No, I'm pretty sure it is. Come on, we wouldn't want you to miss it. With a sharp tug, she hauled him to his feet. What are you doing? He demanded, spraying her in the face with more droplets of spit. Ignoring him, she began dragging him towards the back of the bus. He protested and tried to pull free, but she had several inches on him, and it was pretty evident that he didn't exercise much and had zero fighting experience. This is assault, he cried. This is... Help! Help! She's attacking me! Sneppard and Nolf alike watched with wide eyes as she towed Mr. Business along. No one said a word or moved a muscle. Parking herself in front of the doors, she waited for them to open. They opened on a trio of waiting Nolfs who looked up in surprise to see a Nolf with a firm grip on a wealthy-looking Sneppard. She pulled him to the side, allowing them to board, and giving them each a polite nod in turn. Mr. Business's protests died on his lips, becoming an incoherent blubbering as he watched the Nolfs pass. Once they were all on, and the way no longer obstructed, Salatra gave a heave and tossed Mr. Business out onto the sidewalk. His foot caught as he stumbled, and his briefcase flew from his hands as he hit the ground. Dusting off her hands, she backed away from the now closing doors and headed back up towards her seat. She took her original seat by the woman in question, who was now staring at her red-eyed and slack-jawed. Salatra sighed. I didn't do it for you. I did it because I wanted my seat back. That's all. The look of shock seemed to be this woman's permanent expression now. Releasing her tight grip on her purse, she dug around inside and found a tissue to wipe her eyes. A few moments later, she pulled out 10 Christum and handed it to Salatra. Salatra looked at it and sighed again. You don't have to... I'm really sorry, the woman said, but I'm still freaking out. Would you mind not sitting next to me? All of that, and nothing had changed. Go figure. Welcome to Siphus. Allowing herself a scowl made the woman cringe, and she flinched back as Salatra snatched the money she offered. Sorry that your day has been so bad, she said as she stomped back to an empty seat. Then she sulked the rest of the way home. Thanatom wanted Salatra to suffer. That was the only explanation. She'd been chewed out at work, then harassed on the bus. She was catcalled 3 times and followed for over a block on her way to her apartment. Checking the mail had released a flood of white envelopes with red letters announcing the end of the month. Today could not get any worse. Her first attempt to unlock her apartment was thwarted when she used the wrong key by mistake. Then, while going for the right key, she dropped the entire key ring. She palmed the door in frustration, though it hurt her palm far more than it damaged the door. Bending over to scoop up the keys, just dumped the letters stacked in her arms. Snarling curses under her breath, she gathered them one at a time before collecting her keys and finally unlocking the door. She was so ready to just collapse into her armchair and sulk alone. "Surprise!" came the cry as she swung open the door. Seed Mother, this day would give her no rest. A banner hung in the hallway, a glittery, ridiculous thing that spelled out "Congratulations!" though it had to be folded back on itself to fit in the hall. More offensive than its own presence in her apartment, it was spelled with a D instead of a T. Elaine stood nearby, arms thrown high and wide. Her dining table was visible behind him, and had clearly been set for 2. His being here wasn't that shocking. She'd given him a spare key. For the life of her, though, she had no idea what the occasion was. Letting her breath out in a slow exhale, Salatra forced herself to smile, though she could tell it didn't really stick, and without a word she brushed past him and headed for her bedroom. Setting herself down, she realized she was still in no mood to be sociable, so she took a shower. Part of her felt guilty for making him wait, but he'd sprung the surprise on the worst day of all time. Some of her frustrations washed away with the water pouring down the drain, but flashbacks of a few key figures who'd caused her grief throughout the day gave fresh fuel to her cooling but not yet snuffed out fire. After toweling off, she thought about fixing her hair or applying a bit of makeup. She could smell a lovely dinner out there, and Elaine had dressed rather nicely, but she was too tired to put in that much effort. So she brushed her hair and cheeks and called it good. Throwing on a comfortable shirt and pants, she took a steadying breath and left her bedroom. Elaine was seated at her dining table, and he stood up so fast the chair nearly toppled over. "I hope you don't mind, but I left myself in." "I can see that," Salatra noted, glancing up at the goofy, childish banner. Turning into the kitchen, she grabbed a flavored aquam crystal from the fridge, cracked it open, and dropped it in a glass. It glowed, and the glass began to fill with bubbling water of a pinkish hue. "You'll have to forgive me, Elaine. I'm not in a good mood today. It's been a bad day, so I'm going to be a little rough around the edges." Turning back around to face him, she leaned back into the counter and gave her glass a swirl. "I'm also not sure I understand the occasion." "You're quite all right," he assured her. "Everyone has bad days, and you can be rough if you need to be." Her mind immediately jumped to the man she'd thrown off the bus. She had no intention of being that rough with Elaine, but it had happened, and she hadn't intended that at first either. She took a sip of her drink, savoring the tart flavor from the cherry seed she'd added to the aquam. It was a homemade recipe, of course, the fun kind of practice. Her eyes drifted to Elaine and were immediately drawn to his smile. It was warm and understanding, a constant positive on a rainy day. Then she met his eyes. She'd never gotten close enough to really discern their color, but the life and expression in them was more important to her. He looked at her now with sympathy, but not pity. Elaine had the insufferable habit of doing everything in his power to make people happy. He wasn't blind or oblivious to the world they lived in. He knew that life was rough, especially for people like them. But like his music, he tried to bring life and light and joy everywhere he went. Despite Salatra's grouchy mood, and her deep desire to curl up in an armchair and dim the lights and sip her tart drink and indulge in her misery, she could already feel the effect he was having on her. "Work?" he tentatively prodded. Salatra smirked. "That's where it started." It wasn't long before she laid out her whole day for him. By the time she'd finished, his eyes were wide. "That's awful," he finally admitted. "Yeah," Salatra agreed, gesturing to the already set table with multiple dishes of food laid out. They were covered over with dish towels, like serving cloths at a fancy restaurant, but you could still smell the contents. He'd picked a few of her favorites. "Gonna tell me what this is about?" she asked. He smiled again, and it was so pleasant to look at it was hard to decide whether to watch his mouth or his eyes. "Well, a certain someone knocked their organic chemistry exam out of the park, and they deserve to be celebrated and rewarded." "Congratulations," Salatra said flatly, raising her glass. "I didn't even realize you decided to branch out from music. What'd you score?" He smirked. "Only a 94%. "Elaine, that was last week." "Yes," he said. "And you were stressed out about that exam for the entire 3 weeks leading up to it. Then, when you finally got your results back, you got slammed at work and took no time to bask in your accomplishment. You told me in passing that you got the A, and I decided that wouldn't do. I had an early practice today, so I swung by the store and stopped in to surprise you." She wanted to tear up. He was right. She had been stressed, and then so busy afterwards that she hadn't recovered. She was like a clock that had been wound too tight and jammed itself in its own gears. Crying was a rare occurrence for Salatra, and even now the tears stayed away. Instead, she just felt warm. This man saw her struggles in a world that had been proven happy to turn her a blind eye. And this stupid, kind man had gone out of his way to cheer her up and encourage her. Chuckling, she said, "It wasn't even a final, Elaine. There's still another exam before then, and it's going to be worse." "Then, knowing you, you're going to score a 96% or better on it." "Elaine," she sighed. He cut her off. "I don't know about you, but I'm starving. Shouldn't shock anyone, as I'm a musician by trade and a Nulf to boot, so I've got the double whammy of going hungry. But I spared no expense for this, and it's been torturing me for an hour. I don't mean to brag, but I think it turned out really well." For the first time that day, Salatra was finally able to smile for real. "It smells like one of the better dishes you've made." "I've been practicing," he said, with a shy smile that made him look even cuter. "And while my skills are not up to par with your own, I'd like to think they're at least competent." "No expense spared, huh?" "Well," he admitted, "I did have to buy generic brands to stay within budget, and I did add a few spices I raided from your pantry." When they sat down to eat a short time later, it was good. And maybe that was just in proportion to how awful her day had been, but it was a delicious meal. He even spoiled her with dessert. It wasn't real chocolate. Neither of them could afford that, unless they wanted to go hungry until their next paycheck. But it was still good. After dinner, they did dishes together. He washed and she dried, as had become their custom. Elaine said it kept his calluses in check, and Salatra found that having company made an otherwise tedious chore bearable. "Wine tonight?" he asked when they'd finished. Salatra nodded so eagerly that he laughed. He knew where to find the glasses, cupping them gently in fingers that faded into a lovely silver. As she got out the wine, she thought about something else those fingers could do, and asked, "And perhaps some music to go with it?" He scrunched up his face. "I'm afraid I'm off the clock, Miss Salatra. If I give out free performances to everyone who asks, I'll go broke." They dragged the chairs from the dining room into the empty space that was her apartment's living room. "Oh, I intend to pay you, Mr. Elaine." He raised an eyebrow, and she lifted the wine bottle. His tail fluffed out at the base in that cute way it always did when he was embarrassed, and he gave a quiet, "Ah." "Besides," Salatra continued as she took a seat and poured them each a glass of wine, "you're not performing for just anyone now, are you?" "You're a cruel taskmaster, madam. But who am I to deny the people? I shall make the sacrifice for both of us." Taking a sip, he set down his glass and walked to the closet. Inside, he pulled out a violin case that looked like it had seen better days a century ago. He didn't keep it here, and yet, here it was in her closet. Yes, indeed, some sacrifice he was making by playing for them. Setting the instrument to his neck, he took a few minutes to tune. His ear for pitch was far superior to Salatra's. It was a point of bragging for him, that while other performers were dependent on tuning aids, he could find it by ear. While Elaine tuned, Solatra added a few dry logs and a handful of kindling to her fireplace. Then, with some spare firearm, she got a cozy fire going. Returning to her seat, she sipped her wine and waited for him to finish. When he was ready, he began. Solatra was transported from the room almost immediately. He led with a piece she knew well, as it was the first thing she'd ever heard him perform. Then after a few minutes, he transitioned seamlessly into something entirely new. She glanced at him just to catch him grinning. It must be a piece from his latest performance. She hadn't been able to make that one, so now he was bringing it to her. Her own private show. It was beautiful. Soon her mood was light, and she smiled, taking quiet sips. The lively melody carried away all the bitterness the day had held. For the moment, Siphus was forgotten. All that existed in the world was two people, good wine, a warm fire, and that song. Nearly 15 minutes had passed before Elaine spoke. I intend to keep going, which means I need help. You've had a chance to drink your wine, but my hands are a little full. You mind? Solatra laughed, a testament to his ability to lift her spirits with the simplest, silliest things. You're lucky you don't play woodwind or brass, she teased, as she brought his still full glass to his lips. He started to reply, but she cut him off with the wine. Caught off guard, he sputtered and coughed and made a bit of a mess. They both laughed. Red stained a carpet that had seen much worse. Solatra felt no guilt for the carpet, but his shirt was another story. I know I told you could go rough, but I didn't realize you'd try to drown me, he teased, eyes twinkling in the firelight. Solatra hurried towards the kitchen for a towel, but he called her back. The wine went to my lungs, not my stomach. The shirt will be fine. Stains can come out. You've tormented me with a taste and denied me the full experience. Fine, she said. I'll be gentle. Don't you pour liquids as a profession? I didn't think it was that difficult. Oh, hush, she said, as she shut him up with his wine. When the wine was gone, Solatra remained standing behind his chair. Reaching out, she rested her hands atop his own as he played. Elaine started at first, but transitioned to a slower piece. His fingers worked beneath hers. Closing her eyes, she rested her head atop his own, and his ear flicked against her chin. The music swept them both away. She was no musician, but doing this felt like she was playing with him. His masterful hands molded to his instrument, and her alchemy-scarred hands molded to his. As she gently swayed with him, she found herself wishing, not for the first time, that he would just ask the question already. They'd come to the mutual agreement it was more prudent to wait until they both had more stable employment. But Seed Mother, she was so tired of waiting. This man, who could turn around even the worst of days simply by reminding her that someone saw her and cared about her. This man, who went out of his way to do silly little things to cheer her and encourage her. This man was something she'd never dreamed she could have. Something that Siphus couldn't take from her. She breathed in his scent, cementing the warm, happy feeling in her chest with it and with him. Eventually, the song came to an end. The violin moved to his lap as he reached up to take her hands in his own. His thumbs traced small circles on the back of her hands as they both watched the fire. You pick one yet? Elaine asked. One what, exactly? She queried, bringing her head to rest on his shoulder. A name, for when your record goes away. If it goes away, she corrected. It's dependent on the goodwill of a snapper, after all. He squeezed her hands. When it goes away, he insisted with a tut of his tongue. We really need to work on you and having positive thoughts. It's gonna happen, and you don't want to be caught with your proverbial pants down. I've given some thought to it, but haven't settled on anything I really like. Why? She asked, nudging his muzzle with her nose. Got one picked out for me? I encountered a pretty one a few days ago, and wrote it down to run by you. Oh? I'm rather particular about my name, Solatra said. Any replacement better be similar in theme or feel. Bonus points if it actually has something to do with lightning. Then I think I'm in luck. Have you ever encountered the name Naira? Naira? She tested the word on her tongue, like she was sampling wine. It didn't have much aftertaste, and it certainly front-loaded its flavor. But to its credit, it didn't linger past its welcome. Sell me on it. First selling point. Your best friend and arguably most artistic friend is suggesting it. Nope. That's a point against it, she said. Elaine looked at her with one eye, and she returned his gaze with an eye of her own and a knowing grin. Their faces were close enough, it was the best they could manage. Fine, he said, undeterred. Second selling point. It's a lot shorter, with less syllables to trip over than any iteration of Salatra. Think of how much less strain it will put on your hand to write a name like Naira instead of Salatra on all your lab reports. Ah, right. The wrist strain, she said with a grave nod. It was getting to the point recently where my wrist felt ready to fall off from writing so much, but carving off 2 or 3 letters ought to spare me from the tragic fate of losing a hand. Exactly! Selling point number 3, it has 5 letters, 4 of which are shared with my own name, Elaine. Well, you're now 0 for 3 on your selling points. It's a good thing you aren't a salesman for a living, or you'd be even poorer than you are now. Ah, Elaine said. But I have the stubborn tenacity to keep throwing things at the wall until something sticks. Selling point number 4. It's not a snap name. Oh? That's a promising start. It's actually from Genthis. And selling point number 5, guess what it means? Lightning, she guessed. Nope. Woman known only to dreams, she guessed again. He grinned. She who is full of light. Radiant, shining, and so on. Full of light, huh? You really think that's a good fit for one of the most gloomy people you know? Elaine squeezed her hands. You're not always gloomy. Besides, hard to think of something more full of light than lightning. Squeezing him back, Salatra considered. Okay, that makes your score 2 to 3. Selling point number 6. Consider who's suggesting it. With a scoff, she bumped his muzzle again. That was your first selling point, genius. I know, he said, firelight dancing in his eyes. That's why it's going to work. Chapter 35. Stopping for repairs. Present day. My friend said if anyone could fix it without ripping me off, it was you. So you can fix it, right? Ignoring the kit's question for the moment, Ame rolled around to the other side of the hoverbike, examining the damage. The kit had hit a parked car the night before and fled the scene. Now he wanted the dents banged out, the repulsor replaced, and the paint job restored. All before next storm day so his father wouldn't find out. She bent as far forward as she could to examine the bike's undercarriage without falling out of her wheelchair. Her glasses tried to slide off her muzzle, but a finger to their bridge kept them in place. 1500 Christum, she said. The snappered kit wrung his hands together as his eyes went wide. You're kidding. Ame sighed, running a hand along an undamaged portion of the hoverbike. This is a GZD-25. The new ones retail for at least 22,000 Christum. Parts for these take some time to come in after you buy, because they're already churning out the new 27s, so they don't care about maintenance. And I'm basically throwing in the paint and labor for free. It's a fanina of a deal, kit. He nodded, but his face was crestfallen. I get that, I really do, but I only have 1,000 in my savings. Ame had known from the moment this kit limped the bike into the shop that this job was going to be a loss. She'd read it in the panic on his face, the average nature of his clothing, and the smell of leaking electrum. She drummed her fingers on the arm of her wheelchair, leaning back as she considered. All the while he watched her, his thumbs mashing each other as he waited for her response. How about this, kit? 750 Christum up front, and you work off the other 750 by working for me. His tail twitched in that telltale nervous way that gave most sneppards away, where the tip flicked both ways regardless of the rest of the tail. Even back when Ame could move her tail, she'd never had that precise of control over it. Nolf tails were more flowy. She did miss being at or above average eye level, though. "If I do this," he asked, "it'll be fixed up before next storm day?" "That's entirely dependent on you, Kit," Ame said, using her arms to adjust herself in the wheelchair so she could lean against the back. "It depends on how fast you learn and how hard you're willing to work." He looked frightened at first, but eventually that gave way to hope. "Thank you." Then his ears flattened in shame. "I only have 500 on me at the moment. Do you want that now?" 500 now, and 250 in the next 2 days, so you have time to stop by a bank when they're actually open. But your labor starts first thing in the morning. I open shop at 0700, and I expect to find you waiting outside when I open my doors tomorrow. That brought a bit of the fear back, though she smelled it more than she saw it. Injured as she was, Ame's nose didn't quite work as well as it used to. To his credit, the boy nodded. Then he held out his hand. "My name's Jeremy." Ame stared at the gray and white furred hand in mild amazement, before taking it in her own russet-covered hand. Her hand dwarfed his, so he had to be early teens, and the amount she looked up to meet his eyes was equivalent to what he'd have had to do if she still had use of her legs. He'd be shocked when he saw her work suit. She shook his hand heartily, not wanting to undercut the significance of the gesture he'd offered so casually. Maybe there was hope for the next generation after all. "And mine is Ame. Mr. Jeremy, I look forward to working with you." He nodded eagerly, his hand nearly limp in her firm grasp. "Thank you, Ame. I'm glad my friend told me about you. You're a lifesaver." "I save tech, not lives. I'm a mechanic, not a doctor." The kit let out a nervous laugh, clearly unable to decide whether she was joking or serious. A month or two of working with her would teach him soon enough. He left her store, and she rolled up to the door behind him, locking it. Then came the hard part, flipping the open sign to closed. It hung at normal person shoulder height, where normal people could pinch it in 2 fingers and turn it around as easily as breathing. For Ame, it was a full-body workout, at least for the parts of her body that still responded and functioned like they should. Reaching down through the spokes of the wheels, she gripped a lever and engaged the brakes. She'd only forgotten that once, and the subsequent fall as the wheelchair rolled out from under her had been an embarrassing lesson. Gripping the armrests, she lifted herself out of her seat, scooting a rump she couldn't feel onto the armrest by her right hand. Leaning across the chair to keep it from tipping over on its side, another lesson that had been learned the hard way, she retrieved her grabber stick. It was a small, homemade tool with 2 little plastic fingers on the end that she could pinch together with a trigger mechanism and a string. Still leaning over the wheelchair, she kept grip of the opposite armrest with one hand, while she slowly brought the grabber up towards the sign. With a twist of her wrist and a bit of practiced finagling, she flipped the sign to closed. Then she reversed the process until she was seated in her chair, the wheels were unlocked, and her freedom restored. It was hardly the most strenuous part of her day, but it was one that she'd intentionally made habitual. Could she lower the sign to somewhere she could easily reach it? Absolutely. But then it wouldn't be up near the customer's eye level. Besides, if something wasn't worth working for, then it wasn't worth doing. This was a little thing, and it was a reminder not only of her limits, but that she wasn't going to simply accept those limits. No, she would push herself as much as she could get away with. It was how she knew she was still alive. Through the storefront windows, Ame watched the sun setting through the not-so-distant glass of the bulb's outer wall. The orange light blurred at its edges, so she pulled her glasses off and cleaned them with her breath and her shirt. It cleared the smudge, probably a fingerprint from adjusting them throughout the day, but some scratches remained behind. Might have been there before, or might have just happened. Either way, her critical eye ignored them after 10 seconds of resting her eyeglasses back in their proper place. Traffic continued past her store for a little while, though it thinned out as night fell. It was dark outside, and she realized with a start that she dozed off right at the window. Had she been younger, that might have been embarrassing, but she was well into her 50s now, and she'd come to accept that naps would attack with prejudice and without warning. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she'd worked through lunch today. If she was hungry, then Pico was definitely hungry. She was a terrible mother. Wasn't her fault. She'd never set out to be a mother. It was Pico's fault for stumbling into her lap, so he would just have to live with the consequences of his own terrible choice. Stupid dog. Passing row after row of shelves full of replacement parts, scrap wires, and obscure components she salvaged from junked equipment people sold her, Ame wheeled her way to the back. She flipped off the overhead lights and had the happy realization that she wouldn't have to waste suit power on them tomorrow. She could just make the new kid replace the bulbs. The back of her shop exited into a large 5-acre property that extended all the way up to the glass. She liked it because it gave her glimpses of life outside the bulb, some of which was larger than her multi-story house. The 8-foot fence surrounding her property gave her total privacy, something she'd aided by planting hedges and trees along the perimeter. It meant Pico couldn't see outside the fence and barked a lot at even the smallest noises. But it was his fault for coming to live with her. Her yard had plenty of room for him to run around in and amuse himself. If he wanted to see beyond the fence, he shouldn't have asked her for help. Of course, as Ame glanced at the glass, gazing at the world beyond the bulb, the world where she had been born, the irony was not lost on her. Someone had taken her in, and now she'd never leave the yard. Pico appeared within seconds of hearing the door close. Running full tilt, he leapt into her lap uninvited, nearly tipping her chair backwards. His claws dug into her legs, ripping a fresh tear in the jeans she'd struggled her way into for a good chunk of her morning. Yeah, he needed a trim. His breath was awful too, but that was to be expected. A fresh jackalope rack lay about 20 feet away in a patch of wild grass. The fur and flesh had been almost entirely picked clean, and the ivory bone bore plenty of marks from teething. While Pico was pretty good about keeping pests out of her yard, he was still as unpicky as any deerhound. A corpse that was 2 weeks rotted was just as much a delicacy to Pico as any diet-balanced kibble she might buy for him. Wasn't much incentive to spend money on him, though between kibble and carrion, only one had a tendency to make him throw up. His bad breath was one thing, but waking up to a deerhound vomiting something with worse odor than a sewer all over your bedsheets? That was a lesson she'd only needed once. Stupid dog. Shoving her hand up to protect her face from his eager tongue, she took a hold of his antlers and told him to calm down. This, of course, had little effect. From his perspective, he'd been neglected in the yard all day. When she first adopted Pico, she'd tried letting him live in the shop while she worked, but he'd proven to be rather territorial and had bitten a couple customers. He was a good guard dog, but a terrible mascot. Dumping him out of her lap, she wheeled herself the short distance to her house. Built around an access point to Siphus's understructure, the 2-story home had a deceptively large basement and a custom lift system she'd installed to make her home wheelchair accessible. Pico marched up to where his food and water dishes sat empty on the porch. He sniffed at them, then took up a howl. "Any second," Ame muttered. "I can't roll any faster." Stupid dog. Rolling up to the porch, she pulled a lever set in the wall. An electric hum sounded, and a series of gears clicked to life. A moment later, a flap opened, and kibble poured down a chute and into the bowl. Some deerhounds were smart enough they could have figured out how to activate and abuse a system like this. Lucky for Ame, Pico was dumb as bricks. That was good for both of them. If he had the opportunity, he'd probably eat until he exploded. She replaced the aquam in the filter system above his water bowl with a crystal from her personal pouch, and fresh, cool water refilled the bowl. Pico drank eagerly, as if there wasn't a little stream on the property he could drink from at any time. His water came from the same place, whether it came from a crystal or not, but he would never realize that. Ame chuckled, reaching down with a smirk to scratch behind his ears. His fluffy white nub of a tail wagged as he went back to chowing on kibble. Stupid dog. Leaving him on the porch, Ame made her way into the house to get her own dinner. She'd barely had time to get food out of the fridge and laid out on the counter when Pico started barking. His snarling, too phlegmy bark began to fade as he dashed out into the yard to pursue whatever he'd seen. Even if Ame's condition hadn't left her eye level well below the threshold of the kitchen window, it would have been too dark to see anything outside anyway. Probably another jackalope. The things were garden-destroying pests. Ame had so put the incident out of her mind that she nearly dropped her plate when she heard someone knock on the door. Pico had stopped barking, so there was no reason to suspect anyone was in the yard, much less had walked up to her house. Setting her plate of partly finished dinner on the table, she wheeled her way into the hall. Stopping at the closet, she selected a double-barrel catalyst, which she loaded with firearm slugs. The knocking continued, and still Pico was uncomfortably quiet. Either he'd been bribed, or killed. Wheeling towards the door, she stopped to speak into a cone set in the wall. Shop hours are from 0700 to 1700. We're closed. The cone carried her words to one just like it, set in the exterior wall by the front door. It wasn't anything fancy, like some of the new unreasonably expensive Electrum systems. It was literally just a hollow tube to let her get an idea of who her visitors were, since she couldn't use a peephole. A few moments later, a familiar voice came through to her side. Ame? It's Naira. We could really use your help. Naira? Ame asked to confirm. Then she frowned as the word sunk in. Who is we? Brought a few friends in need of some serious medical supplies. You're the only person in the city who keeps supply, and we're not in a position to visit the hospital. Ame didn't respond at first, and she could hear muffled voices through the tube, as whoever Naira brought with her started asking questions. Keeping the loaded catalyst in her lap, Ame rolled over and unlocked the door. It opened to Naira, her fur as ruffled as what few feathers she still wore. And beyond her, a very large and very mixed group of people supporting each other. Off to the side, the traitorous Pico was getting high off a Tarum crystal. The stupid dog was actually chewing on it. Naira gave her a hopeful smile. Oh, thank you, Ame. With a groan, Ame shut the door in her old friend's face. She needed a moment to process. She'd been mentally prepared to help Naira, maybe even Naira and a friend. But Naira had brought an entire family of sneppards, 2 Nulfin street rats, and a tiger that Ame had assumed dead or deported long ago. She did not have room for so many strays. You've got a big empty house on 5 acres, she thought. You absolutely have the space. How is she supposed to feed so many people? You just got a big cash deposit. Charge the parts for the job, her brain helpfully suggested. She had told Naira that this was the last time she could help. Last time. We both knew that wasn't true. Another knock on the door interrupted all her internal arguments. Ame? Naira called through the door. Please, we have nowhere else to go. It was no different than the stupid dog digging into her yard to chase a jackalope, being too dumb to find the hole again to get back out, then whining at her when it got hungry because now it was her problem. It was no different than the kid who was too young to be driving, who should get in trouble for not being taught before taking a joyride, but whom she was instead going to take a loss to bail out and instruct herself. It was no different from 6 months ago, when Naira had knocked on this very door, almost too tearful to be coherent, and asking for a loan of alchemantic equipment she clearly hadn't brought back. Ame's thumb drummed against the catalyst in her lap. The cool metal surface reassured her that she hadn't fallen asleep again and dreamed about her visitors. A smart person would turn them away. It was obvious they were in serious trouble if Ame seemed like their best option. And Ame was far too old to invite trouble. Her days of being involved in trouble were long gone. Even still, she knew what her answer was going to be. Disappointed in herself, Ame shook her head and opened the door. Multiple sets of hopeful eyes now gazed down at her, but she met only Naira's gaze. Allowing herself the luxury of a long-suffering sigh and a weary smile, Ame asked, Sparks, just what the fanina are you about to drag me into? Had Leo driven past this shop with its massive fenced-off yard on his own, he would never have guessed its true nature. He hadn't grown up near the bulb's edge, and being this close to the world beyond it was always unnerving. His parents had taken him to see when he'd asked, but there wasn't much to see. Just a lot of barren, blackened dirt, devoid of any kind of growth until you hit the jungle line some half a mile away. As a kid, he'd been sorely disappointed not to see any megafauna, but it only took one history class on the Fanina tragedy for him to see how foolish that hope had been. The ravenous things that lived outside the bulb were not the happy, friendly giants of children's stories. To his relief, he didn't see anything waiting beyond the thick glass now either. Just barren dirt and a distant, lush tree line. Having left a quick message for Tolson to reassure him that he and Melissa were both fine, Leo continued helping unload the vehicles. They'd traveled here in a small caravan of vehicles from the Dolahan estate, loading up those most critically wounded. That included Madame Dolahan and the guards injured in the attack, as well as some of their own merry band. Now the vehicles rested in the yard, above a large metal pad hidden about a foot below the ground. Apparently, that's how close the understructure came to the surface, this close to the outer edge of a bulb. This very understructure was where they'd set up something of a triage unit. Those who were physically well enough helped load supplies and injured people into the lift in the house, which took them below. The space was clearly used for vehicle repairs. Oil spots stained sections of the metal floor, which accommodated 3 full bays. A number of rolling carts overflowing with tools had been rolled to the sides so people could be laid out in the center of the room. Electrum lights buzzed overhead, though they'd been dimmed for the sake of the patients, and Leo could hear the distant hum of some kind of generator or compressor. A large supply of crystals, like the ones used in hospitals, were wheeled out, along with a variant of fractal they referred to as Prism. From there, those with expertise set to work tending to the injured. Renetta had suffered a knife wound and a collapsed lung. The tiger had a chunk of wood embedded in his leg, and Naira was getting ready to help with that. Her own shoulder hung asymmetrically with its partner, so she was in need of some medical attention herself. Of the 6 guards they'd brought along for treatment, most of them had broken bones. Melissa and Rolf both had concussions. How Leo hadn't sustained a concussion himself was a miracle. He was a little battered and bruised, but his treatment could wait. And then there was their host, Arana, or Ame as she was now known. The older Nolfin woman rolled around the room in a wheelchair with rubber wheels. Not the small, affordable kind used in hospitals and grocery stores, but the large, high-grade wheels that probably cost as much as Leo's loaner police cruiser. She wore a near-permanent scowl, and while her tone could be clipped, it was obvious that she was willing to help as long as no one expected her to fake happiness about it. Her eyes glowed as she cracked a light blue crystal into a bowl, filling it with water. Grabbing a clean rag, she put it in the bowl to soak before rolling toward where Melissa lay on the floor. Leo set his load down in the corner with the growing pile and walked over to join them. "It's going to be a bit cold, but it should help with the pain," Ame explained as she wrung out the cloth and draped it over Melissa's face. Melissa readjusted it so that it rested across her forehead. "The most important thing now," Ame continued, "is that you rest for the next long while. However long it takes before you start feeling better. Could be 1 day, could be 3. Nothing strenuous or mentally taxing until then, okay?" The Nolf nodded to him as he approached, then pointed down to Melissa. "She only leaves that bedroll for bathroom breaks until her headache is completely gone. Got it?" Leo nodded, then sat down beside Melissa as Ame wheeled her way to the next patient. "Glad to see you're conscious again," he said. Melissa gave a soft groan. "Was I out for a while?" "You were only out for a little bit towards the beginning, but you were incoherent and drifting in and out for the whole ride here." "Did I say anything stupid?" she asked with a look of sudden and genuine panic, though what she'd imagined herself saying, Leo wasn't sure. The truth was that she hadn't said much that Leo could make out, except for a few times when she'd muttered, "We were the lucky ones," before shivering and slipping back into a mumble. So he lied. Only that I was an amazing chief, and that Tolson was more inspiring than either of us. She snorted, laying an arm over her eyes. "Head injuries are rough. I'm sorry you had to hear that." "Why? Because I'm bombing my first 2 weeks as chief?" Because you're bombing your first 2 weeks as chief, she confirmed with a grin. And you deserve the truth. He smirked. Glad I got a friend who's willing to tell me like it is. Anytime, she muttered, with a hint of a delay. They sat there for a few moments, letting the rest of the voices and noise in the room hide their silence. Leo watched the kit as she sang over her mother. It was pretty to listen to, and the glowing of her eyes and palms was mesmerizing as the song continued. Hey, Leo? Melissa asked quietly. Yeah? Thanks for coming to get me. He snorted. My gut said there was trouble. It's been wrong plenty of times before. I'm just glad I listened this time. Besides, you guys basically got yourselves out. Don't think they would have unlocked the doors without you throwing your weight around. I do have quite a bit to throw, he noted, glancing down at his non-existent belly. Had he remembered to eat anything since breakfast? His stomach growled its answer. I don't think you're allowed to make that joke when we're friends with Tolson. He raised an eyebrow, but her eyes were still buried under the fur of her arm, and she didn't see. Tolson's the one who started making those jokes in the first place, Leo noted. It's called an insecurity, Leo. No, that's what the guards are. What? Insecurity. There was a long pause before her chest sank in an enormous sigh. You're an idiot sometimes. Only sometimes? Depends on the day. Anything else I can do to help your headache? Leo asked, watching Naira and Ame prepare to remove the chunk in Tigra's leg. Yeah, talk quieter. Can do, he said, falling silent. Wrapping an actual broomstick in cloth, they handed it to Tigra, who stuck it between his teeth and nodded. It was about to get loud in here. He felt Melissa tap his leg and looked down towards her. I said talk quieter, not stop talking, she complained. Snorting, he replied. Never been good at making that distinction. Tolson's not around to carry the conversation, and I'm having trouble keeping my thoughts from fuzzing, so it falls to you, Chief. Leo let out a long sigh. Tigra wasn't nearly as loud as he expected when the bulk of the wooden chunk was removed. Big Man groaned into the gag, but otherwise took it like a champ. Why me? Leo asked. I literally just explained it to you. No, why make me chief? Doesn't make sense. Maybe Bradburn also experienced head trauma that day? Melissa offered with a wry smile. Thought you were supposed to be the serious one. I'm agreeing with you. His decision to promote you defies logic and reason. Leo shook his head. But Bradburn doesn't. I don't think the man has a single random or spontaneous bone in his body. Everything he does is deliberate and intense. Yeah, Melissa agreed. I've had a theory for a little while now, but you're not going to like it. Try me. Melissa shifted her arm back enough to peek at Leo through one half-lidded eye. You sure? They were digging around with forceps and a scalpel now to pull splinters from Tigra's leg. It seemed like an excellent time for Leo to stop watching and give Melissa his full attention. Yeah, you've got good insights. All right, Melissa said, hiding in the crook of her elbow once more. He misjudged you. Meaning he thought I'd actually be okay at the job? No, I think he knew you'd suck. It didn't sting. After all, it was what he wanted to hear. He said, ow, but it was hard to be hurt by an assessment he agreed with. Let me finish, Melissa grumbled. He's worked with you for as long as we have, but he hasn't seen you out in the field like we have. His exposure to you in action consists of a couple of fractal incidents with a lot more snops than just you two. But you needed to keep your job, and he mistook your panic for desperation. When you followed all of his suggestions, I think he assumed that you were easy to push around and manipulate. Am I not? Melissa flailed out with her other arm, catching Leo's knee with a slap of her palm. I said to let me finish. He assumed you didn't have a spine, which was a decent read based on the information he had. Wow, I'm literally sitting right here. As Tolson would say, words hurt, Melissa. She ignored him. I think he wanted you in there because you've gone along with him before. You're a perfect candidate because, in his mind, he's got you trained to do what he wants. Leo considered the train of logic that had been hounding him for a few weeks, as another train car dropped into place in the line. He did use the exact words, "I've been grooming you for this, Parsons." And he was pretty unhappy when I deliberately poked fun at his expense in Paddock's office. He's never taken teasing well, but he was particularly sensitive. Plus, he did threaten to fire me if and when he could. He did? Melissa asked, lifting her arm away to reveal the shock in both her eyes. Twisting his face in a grimace, Leo said, "Not in so many words. It was more of a warning that someday he might be my boss again, and he'd remember my flippancy, insubordination, irreverence, fill in the blank of ways that I annoy Bradburn." "So do you play along?" Her eyes pierced his, searching them for a preview of his answer. He shrugged. "Still working that out. Depends on what the situation calls for, I guess. Though I think the guy needs to be told no more often." "Nobody tells Walter Bradburn no," Melissa said with a chuckle. "The only ones who've done that and lived to tell about it are the people in this room." Leo glanced around to take them in. "And that's just Bradburn," he added. "How much worse do you think his old 13 pal Paddock's gonna be?" "Oh, worse, undoubtedly. We've both met the guy. The worst kind of rich person. Thinks the world lives on his plate for him to take everything he likes and that others should pay him for his scraps." "Comforting to realize that's ultimately who we work for." "Don't remind me," Melissa groaned, covering her eyes again. A glance upward showed that Naira was working with Tigra to use magic to heal his leg. They must have finished all their digging, and it was safe to watch them again. "This goes way over our pay grades," Leo noted. "Yep." He paused. "We're gonna tackle it anyway, aren't we?" Melissa nodded into her elbow. "Yep." "Nina." "Yep." Conversation slowed after that. It was mostly one-sided anyway, as exhaustion caught up with them both. Eventually, the makeshift doctors had tended to everyone, and Melissa fell asleep. Leo found the light controls, lowering them before pulling Melissa's arm away from her face so it wouldn't lose circulation. He found his own spot near Melissa to lay down, using his jacket as a pillow. In the morning, he'd call Tolson and bring him up to speed. But for now, he just wanted to sleep. Moira continued to sing quietly, her own efforts to heal her mother refusing to take a rest. He hoped that lovely song brought them both as much peace as it brought him, as he finally fell asleep. Water break. Yay! That's 2 chapters. I think we can squeeze one more in. What about you guys? All right. Chapter 36. Coffee break. Black coffee still the go-to? Good to know that when the world's collapsing, there's still some things you can count on. Keep your coffee beans hidden, or Naira will eat them by the handful. Naira will never return anything you let her borrow, and if you tell Naira don't come back, she'll say, "See you tomorrow." Inserting a Fyram pellet into her coffee maker, Ame shook her head while she started brewing a fresh pot. "And injuring just yourself wasn't enough? Now you've inspired multiple generations to seek out experiences that will leave them with unique and painful scars?" Naira reached into her shirt to hold a cracked Curum crystal to her shoulder. They'd attempted to relocate it, and best she could tell, they'd succeeded. It had been an excruciating experience, and the pain was only now settling into more of a dull ache. She did have a history of being rough on her body, but if she lived in fear of pain, she'd die an old maid. She couldn't imagine a worse end to life. With a smirk, she replied, "Never would have pictured myself as a role model." Ame snorted, but said nothing. Eventually, coffee was finished, and she wheeled it back to the table. "Something wrong with the suit?" Naira asked. "No," Ame said, as she poured a cup for her guest. "I actually take good care of my equipment." She directed a pointed look at Naira, which Naira did her best to ignore. Ame continued anyway. "But my body has different standards, tolerances, and limits than my mind. I wear the suit in the mornings, but by lunchtime the pressure on my hips and spine hits points that Kyurem can't help. The movements are still jarring anyway, which doesn't help. The fact it works at all is still a small miracle. I can't imagine the mental gymnastics to get the electrum to work the way you want." "It is mentally fatiguing," Ame admitted. "But it's better than simply accepting the cards life has dealt. If I can use what remains of me to make my life better, I will." It was a philosophy they shared. It was part of why they got along, even when they didn't agree. "Did you do it?" Ame asked as she sipped from her coffee. Naira didn't have to ask what she meant. 6 times. "Seed mother," Ame breathed. She tapped her thumb against the rim of her coffee mug. "Well, at least they all deserved it, right?" "Yeah," Naira nodded, to enforce the truth she needed to believe. "Have you listened to any of the reports?" Ame shook her head. "I live on the edge of the bulb for a reason. With the exception of you, and now Tigra, all my old acquaintances and ties think I'm dead. Officially, Orana died of complications in the hospital after her hoverbike crashed. As far as Cyphus is concerned, Ame is a totally different rescue. I don't care what happens in or to Cyphus, as long as it stays the Fanina away from me. And here I am, bringing in the excitement to your doorstep." Naira offered a guilty smile. Running a thumb along her shoulder, the bruises were lessening. It would take a lot more treatment for them to go away, but the pain was getting easier to ignore. "Do you care what happens to me?" she asked. "Sparks, you've asked a lot of dumb questions over the years. I'm going to pretend you didn't just swallow your own kneecap." Naira smirked. "I've missed you, my friend." Waving a dismissive hand, Ame took another sip of coffee. "Did you get them back? Your family?" Naira's throat seized as her stomach fell through the floor. She shook her head. "Not yet. I'm still working on it." With a sigh, Ame gave a soft nod. "And your new friends? You're working with snobs now." Naira smirked, taking a sip of the coffee in front of her. It was quite bitter, an acquired taste. "Wasn't my first choice. Bradburn called in his favor and asked me to aid his detectives in solving the murders I was causing. He didn't phrase it that way, and I can't prove he knew. But it seems foolish to believe he didn't know that I was behind it. I think he was hoping that bringing us together would lead to me being caught. But that's not how things worked out." "So how did they work out?" "Well, now you've got the police chief of District 3 and the Minister of Labor sleeping in your basement." Ame choked on her coffee. Pounding on her chest with her fist helped, but it still took a few moments before she could get out. "You brought a 13 to my house?" Naira gave her best innocent smile. "Surprise!" A long silence spread between them, broken only by Ame's claws as they clicked out an unsteady rhythm on the table. Turning away, she stared down the hall towards the lift. Finally, she said in a calm, quiet voice, "We're going to have to kill her. You realize that, right, Sparks? If Bradburn and his boss are trying to silence you and Tigra and the Snops, if she lives, we all die. Maybe it's too late and you were all going to die anyway, but you had the courtesy to rope me into it. I live on the bulb's edge away from trouble, yet you've dragged trouble into my house and used me to help stop its bleeding. Crash enough while driving, and eventually you'll have a collision you don't walk away from. You're not invincible, no matter how much you've come to believe you are. When are you going to watch where you're going and think about the consequences of how you're driving? Even if you walk away from this collision, how many are going to die in the pileup you cause? A half dozen excuses and justifications flitted through Naira's mind, but nothing stuck. She wanted to defend herself, say that the criticism was unfair, but harsh as it was, there were a few grains of truth to it. Naira smirked. Have you ever known me to slow down? If I slow down, someone dies. If I speed up, someone dies. Given the choice, well, it's not even a contest, but at least I haven't stopped driving. Ame scowled. Life doesn't always leave us a choice. Sometimes big things happen, things outside of our control, and then things are taken from us, things we can't get back. If you really believed that, you'd live in a happy little single-story home with a wheelchair ramp where everything was easy and customized to accommodate you. But the Orana I knew fought to earn her place in the world. The Orana died in a hoverbike crash, and the Ame that survived it actually walked away, Naira countered. The Ame that walked away spends every day of her life fighting to make life what she wants it to be. She doesn't roll over and accept the dross that life asks. She doesn't roll over and accept the dross that life asks her to content herself with. She fights to make her life better. That's the friend who has always inspired me. I refuse to give up the fight for a better life. And I know that no matter how attached you are to your safe, private little corner of the world, that fight still lives in you. The fight was coming for you eventually. I just accelerated the process. The question is, are you going to be stubborn and fight it alone? A distant cuckoo clock announced the arrival of the new day, though the sun wouldn't be up for another 6 hours. Ame stared down into her coffee. Gray was sneaking into her hair and the fur of her cheeks, and her ears weren't quite as perky as Naira remembered. In that moment, she looked almost frail. Her lips twitched, and she shook her head. Selatra herself. Little miss, I'm going to go kill as many 13 as it takes to get my family back, and this is my burden to bear, so just give me what I need and let me handle it myself. Is going to preach to me about stubbornness and handling things alone? It's like parenting. Do what I say, not what I do. Ame snorted. Yeah, if you're a terrible parent. Then she sighed. I know you're still going pretty strong, but my glory days are over. The fingers of old age are poking through the soil and trying to drag me back down to eternal rest in the dirt. It's the only thing these toes can feel anymore. Naira took a sip of her coffee, and even that was enough to send a tweak of pain through her shoulder. Age is coming for me too, but I'm not going to slow down. And I'm going to repair the hoverbike you limped in here on and get you back on the road, aren't I? They met each other's gaze, and Naira couldn't suppress her smile. Ame rolled her eyes, shaking her head with the wry smile of a parent who knows they're about to cave to their child's wish. Seed Mother, Sparks, if your bull-headed charge straight into danger mentality is going to get you killed, then my soft heart's going to be the death of me. At least that way we die on our terms. Ame chuckled. I wouldn't have it any other way. Though the kitchen air was dripping with the scent of cheap coffee, Naira found her drink suddenly more pleasant. They sipped in silence for a few moments before Ame asked, Where did you find the homeopathic nurse? Excuse me? The kit with the good set of pipes. Naira brought her cup to rest in her lap, enjoying its warmth on her hands. That would be Moira Dolahan, daughter of Renetta Dolahan, the member of the 13 who is now a guest in your basement. The daughter of a 13 has medical training? Not from what I can gather. So what then? Ame asked with a skeptical glance. Self-taught. Naira shrugged. Somewhat, though I've been teaching her what I can. And the singing? That's all her. Running her thumb along the rim of her cup, Naira smiled as some of Moira's tunes replayed in her head. She leaned in conspiratorially. Ame, She hears the magic. Her old friend looked at her like she'd just suggested that Nolfs and Sneppards were the same species. Sparks, what kind of bad batches of Prism have you been feeding that poor kit to give her auditory hallucinations? Naira grinned. With a shake of her head, she said, That's just it. I thought it was something like that at first, too. That it would pass as her system got used to working with Prism. But it hasn't. If anything, it's sharpened. She says that every type of magic has a special song that identifies it, and when she sings along, the magic responds. I have never heard of magic working like that, Ame said slowly. Neither have I. I've taught Sneppards before at the university, but they've never mentioned it. But there's no denying the girl's gifted. You've seen the results. Her mother had a knife embedded in her chest cavity, a collapsed lung, and a whole lot of internal bleeding. But her condition when we arrived? That was after one treatment from the kit. She literally stabilized her mother enough for her to survive the trip here for further treatment. Ame frowned. I looked at the wound when she got here. There was still visible scarring, but as healed over as it was, I assumed she'd been treated the whole way. Shaking her head, Naira reiterated, That was the result of one treatment. So, you're telling me your kit's found a new way of casting magic? Does she visualize it all with it? Naira shrugged. Maybe a little. I think she struggles with visualization, though. Her oral method, on the other hand, seems to come naturally to her. She sings, and the magic responds. There's no way it's faster to cast that way than visualization, Ame noted, her eyes having lost their disbelief and instead shifting to a look of consideration. Speaking isn't faster than thinking. Nodding, Naira said, You're right, but I think what she lacks in speed, she makes up in efficiency. She seems to capture more of a reaction by singing. So while you and I cast quickly, there's a lot of energy loss. In her case, she decreases her energy loss by casting slower. As I observe the effects, it's a trade-off between power and speed. Do you want an immediate but weaker effect, or are you willing to wait to foster a stronger effect? That shines through most brilliantly in how she uses Kyurem. Holding up her hand, Naira pointed to the area between her finger and thumb. I was shot here. Bullet passed through, left a clean hole. I patched it up with Kyurem over the first few days, but you know how long it takes Kyurem to work. How long do you think it took to heal to this point? Leaning over, Ame took her hand and turned it back and forth as she examined it. The scars were still visible, faintly, but the skin was almost back to its full color. You had an actual hole? That's several months of Kyurem treatments to repair to a stage like this. 1 week. Her friend raised a graying eyebrow. You're kidding. Naira grinned, feeling like a child sharing an exciting new secret. Admittedly, she used isopropyl crystals, but the result speaks for itself. After a few long moments of examination, Ame let go of her hand. That's incredible, she admitted. Has she taught you how to do it yet? Naira smirked. Are you kidding? With how tone-deaf I am. But I do hope that maybe she can teach Elaine. Maybe her method would work for him, where mine never did. Thinking of her husband drove a spike of pain and reality into the excitement, and her mood came crashing back down to Cyphus again. It was pleasant to think of a future where she could introduce the two music lovers to each other. Maybe not realistic, but it gave her something to hope for. Actual reality was that her actions had inflicted great pain on her husband, so she needed something to cling to, something to make it up to him. Ame shifted in her wheelchair, hands tugging on her shirt to straighten out where her movement had bunched together. Hey, do you think she might be able to help me? Kyurem was a healing accelerant. It couldn't restore life where something had died, and it couldn't fix what the body considered no longer broken. You applied it while the wound was fresh and healing. Kyurem couldn't help scars. They both knew this, so despite Naira's weak proffer of maybe, Ame shook her head. Sorry, Sparks. That was a dumb thing to ask. I'm already too far gone. My body's used to this now. Can't imagine a world where it goes back. Still wouldn't hurt to try. Maybe, Ame said, but her distant tone and gaze spoke volumes. She wasn't holding on to any false hopes. Still, she offered a smile. Just because something can't be repaired doesn't mean you're out of options. You can still limp a smoking bike across the finish line. The bike may not look pretty, but you can get it there. Bringing her coffee up to her lips, she sipped and held it there, staring past Naira. So, Naira ventured after drinking from her own mug. You're going to help us? Not with the physical side of things, obviously. I can equip you guys and give you a fighting chance, but we can tackle that in the morning. For now, I have company, and I'd like to enjoy it. Despite Salatra's impatience, Naira agreed. It was nice to just catch a breath and enjoy the coffee. There'd be plenty of racing around in the days ahead. Moira wasn't sure when she'd fallen asleep, but she awoke with a start. The fur on her cheek was flattened at an awful angle, and she couldn't feel her arm. Pins and needles and fire were sure to come in the next minute or two. Glancing around, there were a few patients down here still sleeping off their injuries. A couple of guards, and the 2 snops. Stretching, she made no attempt to cover her yawn. Her arm stopped feeling quite so dead and heavy as circulation started flowing once more. She waited until the painful prickles went away before taking a fresh dose of Prism. No sense in exacerbating that experience. She listened to the breathing patterns of each remaining patient in turn. In focusing so much on her mother yesterday, she'd neglected everyone else. She finally found a talent in life, and the first thing she did with it was use it selfishly. Go figure. Making up for it now, she spent a Curum crystal on each guard, helping to address a few fevers and internal injuries. Her debate on whether to help the Snops lasted only half a second. The more she saw of them both, the more they seemed like decent people. She probably didn't agree with their political views or need for uniforms, but there were more to people than just those things. Detective McKinley's breathing changed as Moira worked. Without meaning to, she'd woken her up. Despite that, the detective said nothing until Moira finished. Thank you. There was a bit of a headache when you started, but it's gone now. Moira nodded. I'm glad. Her gaze drifted over to the man awkwardly curled on the ground. She listened to his breathing, to his song. Slow and droning, there were elements that would catch or stick, not coming through on every breath, though it seemed they were supposed to repeat. His insides must be a mess. Had he not told anybody? Any idea what happened to him? She asked. Rolling her head to the side, the detective regarded her boss. He's been through a lot. I think the most recent one is that his ribs are still messed up from what happened at the hospital. He was hit by an ambulance. Oh. Oh, Brack, that was him? Wow, Moira said, hearing her own cadence change its pattern as she lied. Who would do something like that? It was the friends of that Rolf kit. Leo was trying to stop them from gassing the place, tussled with their leader, and got blindsided by an ambulance. I just wish I'd been there. Then she turned to glance at Moira. You're friends with Rolf and Naomi, right? Don't suppose you know who would have done that? Nope, Moira said, trying to reassure herself that the detective couldn't hear how obvious Moira's song made it that she was lying. Sorry to hear that, but I'll see if I can help now. Cracking a fresh Curum crystal, Moira pressed it to his chest as she worked to blend the Curum song with his own. She felt warmth through his shirt as the magic took hold in his chest. Progress was slower than she expected. The damage must be extensive. Halfway through the crystal, he started to groan and roll around. His first sentence was complete nonsense, something confusing enough to make Moira stumble with continuing the song. His next sentence was pretty clear. Too early, he groaned, reaching out with his arm as if searching for an alarm clock. What he found was the detective's nose, which he pounded a moment later with his fist as if that would stop the singing. Ow! The detective yelled, before bonking her boss in the back of his head. That, of course, changed his song as his body began to report a fresh injury, but it also brought him from a state of semi-consciousness to full consciousness. "What in the fanino was that for?" he asked, rubbing at the back of his skull and peering at the world through half-lidded eyes. "You smashed my nose!" Rolling to face her, he squinted at her, then gave a grunt. If you didn't deserve it, then I'm sorry." "What do you mean, if you didn't deserve it?" Detective McKinley demanded as she reached over and flicked the end of his nose. He flinched, his whiskers curling into a half-snarl as he groaned and turned his face away. "It's kind of hard to find the notes when you keep squirming," Moira sang, desperately trying to match what Prism helped her hear in his voice. "What?" he asked in a groggy voice. A second later, Detective McKinley clamped a hand over his mouth. "Shut up so Moira can heal you." "Actually," Moira sang, "I can't hear his breath when you do that." With a mumbled apology, the detective removed her hand, and the adults stopped making Moira's work harder. Eventually, the crystal was spent, and she sat back on her heels. "How do you feel?" "Abused," Leo grumbled, before Detective McKinley flicked him in the cheek. "Better," he corrected. "I feel better. I'm thrilled to be awake. Nothing I love more than mornings spent with people where I'm supposed to make words with my brain and function." The notes in his voice still resounded with pain and damage. Naira had warned her that Curum could only do so much. Maybe she was running into wounds Curum couldn't fix. "If you need another treatment later, just ask," Moira said. He nodded with a grunt and a single word of thanks. Leaving them to their business, Moira wandered upstairs. Her nerves wouldn't calm until she found her mother, and her stomach wouldn't quiet until she had breakfast. To her relief, she discovered she could take care of both. Her mother sat in a wicker chair on the porch, looking out over the property, a small mug resting in her lap as she drank in the morning sun. A few guards were eating in the kitchen and helped direct Moira to a plate and some food. Then she joined her mother. Closing the door behind her helped with the illusion of privacy, but the world around her was forgotten as soon as she started into her meal. She hadn't realized how hungry she was. Her mother's breathing looked normal, though Moira's prism helped her to hear the real story. The punctured lung had been patched up, but hadn't wanted to heal any further. They said nothing, silence broken only by the scraping of Moira's fork and the slight rasp to Renetta's breathing. The longer the silence stretched, the more awkward Moira felt. She wanted to talk to her mother, but she couldn't decide how to start. Brack, had it always been this difficult just to talk? "You walked up here?" she finally asked. Immediately she regretted it. It was a stupid question. This was Renetta Dolahan, self-made billionaire and two-time assassination survivor. Of course she'd walked herself up here. Her mother offered a small nod. "I got tired of staring at concrete, so I came out to watch the sunrise." The sun was high enough that must have been several hours ago. "I didn't wake you then?" her mother asked. Moira tilted her head, pausing her bite of eggs. "You don't think so? Why?" "Well, you did fall asleep on my chest, so I had to sneak out from under you." Moira's eyes widened, and she couldn't stop from blurting, "I'm sorry." Her mother chuckled, and it turned into a cough. "Embarrassed?" "Of course not," Moira lied. "I just feel bad. All that pressure in a sore spot. And I shouldn't have fallen asleep anyway. Not when you still sound..." Renetta cut her off with another chuckle. "You literally saved my life, and you're beating yourself up for not achieving a perfect result." Her gaze left the yard, and she regarded her daughter with a small smile. "You really are my daughter, dearest." Moira could feel the heat flooding her cheeks, and she turned her attention back to her food. Looking anywhere was preferable to meeting her mother's eyes. She hadn't earned that. "Thank you," her mother said quietly. Moira winced at the way her vowels carried just a bit too much breath now. Swallowing her bite, she gave a quick nod. "Yeah." "Naira told me this morning that you talked her into staying, and that I would have died if you weren't so gifted." Moira choked on her next bite of eggs. If she couldn't look at her mother before without blushing, how the brack was she supposed to after hearing something like that? That said, the implication was that Naira was the one who saw Moira as gifted, and Renetta was just relaying that. Perhaps you should slow down a bit, her mother noted, as Moira continued to cough up flecks of yellow egg. When she could finally speak, Moira replied, I've already lost one parent. I really don't want to lose the other. It's nice to have at least one around. Her mother was quiet for a long moment, then said, I haven't really been around. Moira's fork scraped against her plate, all her attention funneled into scooping up another bite. In as nonchalant a voice as she could force, she said, You've been busy. A lot on your plate. Her mother sighed. True, but that's no excuse for letting things fall by the wayside. I forgot your birthday. I know, Moira said, keeping her face turned away. I'm sorry. Moira chuckled, her fork twirling pointlessly on her plate. It's fine. I don't think that's true, dearest. There was nothing to say to that. Setting her plate in her lap, Moira made an effort to keep her tail stiff and still. Years of growing up as a Dolahan had taught her an important lesson. You did not show weakness in front of Renetta Dolahan. Public tears were a disgrace, indicative of a lack of self-control and emotional stability. Bottle that dross up until you're in the privacy of your own room. That way, no one thinks less of you. I miss him, you know. Your father. Moira flinched. Official grieving for Charles Dolahan had lasted less than a week. Renetta made it clear in that time that she would carry on his legacy. Fanina, she intended to surpass it. Any time the guards tried to talk about Moira's father, they received a sharp reprimand from Renetta. Despite all of Sergei's reassurances to the contrary, Moira had come to assume that her parents' marriage had always been about the money, that her mother was simply a shark. Her finger tapped the edge of her plate, and with more snap than she intended, she asked, If you miss him so much, why do you never talk about him? Her mother's exhale was pained in more ways than one. She took a long time to find her answer. Because while losing him was a hurt that nearly broke me, I saw what it did to you. I didn't want your life to end because his had. So I decided that I had to be strong. For both of us. If I didn't keep going, I feared what effect that would have on you. And I didn't want you to be trapped by the pain. So instead you just left me to deal with the pain alone? Moira asked, her cadence gaining tempo and pitch. I thought being reminded of him would be painful. So you decided to act like he'd never mattered, to leave me thinking I was the only one who'd ever cared about him, to make me realize I'd lost the only parent who actually loved me? Moira's breaths were sharp and quick through her nose. Her tail was thumping the seat, but she didn't care to hide it. Blinking wasn't enough to keep the large tear from blazing a trail through the forest of fur on her cheek. Her head was hot, but cooled with a growing clarity. Her questions weren't entirely fair to her mother, but it felt good to get her fears out in the open, and she had no intention of taking them back. Moira heard the clatter of the coffee mug as her mother set it on a nearby table. Heard the shudder of the wicker chair as Renetta stood up, no doubt to storm off. Heard the click of claws on stone. Let her leave. Moira wouldn't apologize, wouldn't beg. Moira was a Dolahan, and Dolahans had to be stoic rocks of unfeeling and... Her mother's arms slid over her shoulders, and she was pulled tightly against her mother's chest. Moira, dearest, I am so sorry. The hitch in her mother's voice was so prominent, Moira would have heard it even without Prism. It was enough to burst the dam. Ignoring the growing wetness of her cheeks, Moira reached up to grip her mother's arms. She swallowed painfully, and her voice cracked. Fine. No, her mother said firmly, so close Moira could feel her warm breath tickling the little hairs inside her ear. I've failed you as a mother, and not been there when you needed me most. That changes now. You didn't give up on me, so forgive me for ever giving up on us. Moira's whiskers twitched as she sniffled to clear her nose. Forcing out the words felt like untangling her own tongue as she whispered, I forgive you. Just don't leave me alone anymore. Oh, never again, dearest, Renetta whispered back, her head pressed to Moira's. Through the tears and the comforting, long-neglected embrace, Moira felt a newfound appreciation for the warmth and beauty of the sun. But it couldn't hold a candle to the warmth flooding her heart. Squeezing her mother's arms tightly, Moira determined to make this moment last forever.